one of the things you mentioned in this book about inequality, notice has been widely happening around the world. I mean, as globalization deepens, we see the inequality. For example, we notice that, for example, the 1% of the U.S. Most elite or people in the top bracket, that their wealth is almost equal to 45% of the mass population, and that actually in many developed countries have the same trend on that. And whereas also the company is going global, but then they are not probably benefiting exactly the home country or the host country of that. For example, NAFTA was blamed for hovering out the Midwest and not benefiting U.S. on. I was talking to Martin Wolf. He was saying capitalism is global, but democracy is local. So if the population locally is not happy, then politician needs to find a scapegoat for that, and China easily to become a scapegoat very often. So what do you think about this inequality issue, and where the gap is getting wider and wider in the last several decades, and also even during the pandemic, I mean, we see the 1% is getting even wealthier. Stock market is all-time high now. So how we explain that, and what are the true challenges for our contemporary world?
I think you have to be careful here to separate different kinds of inequality, right? So there's inequality in income, which is what perhaps we first think about. And the top 1% is mostly about inequality in income. And then what you were talking about at the end there, which I think is becoming increasingly important. And some politicians in the United States, like Elizabeth Warren, for instance, be focusing much more on wealth inequality than on income inequality. And as you say, there's been this enormous explosion of wealth inequality during the pandemic, much more so in the United States than in Europe, for example, because the US stock market has gone up so much. And largely because the big tech companies are here in the US, and it's their enormous success during the pandemic, which has driven up those stock market values. But there's also the inequality we write about in our book, which is the inequality of respect, and of which in the US seems to come with education. And to us, that's the deepest problem, because the people, these people without a BA, have been sort of left behind. They're not politically represented. And what you say is exactly right. Our colleague Bob Kahane used to say that the major force today in international relations is what is happening within countries. That's exactly like what Martin Wolf said about democracy is local and globalization is global. Well, the threats to globalization today are coming from within countries, not from between countries. And we think it's this, if you like, disrespect of this separation or leaving these people behind who favor populist solutions that are the real threat to globalization. I mean, if you get another decade of Mr. Trump, then it's not clear how much will be left of globalization at the end of the half.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just to go back to what you said about NAFTA, speaking to some of the economists who were in the Clinton administration when NAFTA was passed, they knew that jobs would be lost in the US. But what they thought was that, well, this is a good time for the US to upskill. And so that those jobs would be lost, but those workers would be better skilled, they would retrain them, and then that would lift everyone. But what happened was NAFTA passed, the jobs were lost, but the upskilling never took place. So those people were sort of thrown out into the wilderness to fend for themselves. And that's going to foment a lot of anger over a period of time when people feel like they're not participating. They're not, when the rest of what they see as being, a wealth increasing among some groups, and they're not getting any part of that increase in the size of the pie. So, and that's a failure also of democracy in the US.
Yeah, I think U.S. is still very strong in those, among the 100 top universities, U.S. has half of that and attract talents around the world, make a very innovative country. I think that probably is the core strength that U.S. has. And I think China is also learning that. Of course, China has over 3,000 universities, currently on campus, 35 million students on campus. So I think that education probably is really, according to your study, is really one of the key factors that China is paying a lot of attention to that. Perhaps I would like to have David to comment on that as well. You've been living in China since 2016. I mean, and also you've been you study a lot of the wages development and all those labor economics and financing, and so maybe what's your take on that? Compare with the country you come from, U.S., and also the country you already lived in for the last 7 years already. Yeah.
Well, I'll speculate about it for a minute. There's one term that I hear in Chinese that's a term that they use for taxi drivers or for anybody that operates equipment or any sort of skilled job, and it's shifu. And it basically is the way people show respect to a manual worker. And a lot of these people are much poorer than typical people at equivalent jobs in the US. But I don't think they feel the pressure and the despair. Although, some of the delivery guys, they're usually young guys from the countryside, they work extremely hard, very long days. And they may be under a lot of pressure from their employers to do things rapidly. But even people working in the parks and stuff, I don't feel like they think they're looked down upon. Where I think American working class people now think they're just flat out looked down upon. And that, naturally that stokes anger and sort of a feeling of hopelessness. Do you think that's a right interpretation of what's going on?
Yes, absolutely. And that's also something that separates the U.S. from, say, Europe, right? So if you go and travel in Europe, there's a lot of respect paid for people who do manual work that we don't see in the U.S.
But it's also true that some of it's common with Britain too. So one thing that many people have written about, and I think it's very important, is people who used to work for Bethlehem Steel in Baltimore, for instance, there's a new book called Fulfillment about Amazon. Where my grandfather died in a mining accident in Yorkshire, in the village where my father grew up, that mine is no longer there. The unions are no longer there. The solid, rock hard labor people who used to vote for the Labour Party are not there. They're voting conservative, and there's an Amazon warehouse on the site where the mine was. All right. Now, those jobs, many people have written how hard it is to work in an Amazon warehouse or so-called fulfillment center, but they're not dangerous like working in the mine, and they're not dangerous like working in the steelworker was, and they're relatively well paid. I mean, Amazon is paying something like $15 an hour in the US. But there is a sort of sense of despair that this is meaningless work that's working on a clock. And, these are more, what's the word? Anyway, they're more sociological accounts or individual accounts of people who've lived these lives and written about them. And there's a feeling that the meaning of life, is not what it was in those towns. And there's been a lot of loss of society. I mean, in these Yorkshire mining towns, there were these famous brass bands, and there were famous soccer clubs, and there was a social life built around those jobs, dangerous and dirty though they were. And there's no similar social life built around an Amazon warehouse. So I think that is happening pretty much, throughout.
Actually, as Professor Deaton and Professor Case just said, the American have this phenomenon that people, if there's high school, they're not pursuing university, and they don't have a very bright future. And same mentality actually is happening in China as well. And And also people didn't even bother to go to the vocational school or other specialized college because everybody wants to go to university. So that is not really a healthy thing. But on the other hand, Chinese people do work very hard. I mean, there's talk about 724 or 966, 9 hours a day, 6 days a week or something. I also want to get our two distinguished scholars' advice is that, when this kind of a culture issue, how does that play in inequality or the country development or the prosperity? For example, I was invited to bid farewell for the former U.S. ambassador in China, and he said actually his impression on China is that the Chinese people are working very hard, diligent people. They have attaches great importance on education, and also they have a great stick to the family values as well. There's a tremendous family value. According to the population consensus, 10 years ago, there's about 4 persons in the family. Now it's about 3 something. So China is also changing on that as well. So what I'm asking is that would the culture, China has a 5,000 years history. There's always, trying to be neutral and inclusive, and would that play something in the country development as well? Or inequality issue as well. China actually, there's a saying in China, they don't mind that there's not enough, but they mind very much if not redistribute fairly. So we have this redistributing upward, in using your term, not downward, not trickling down. The wealth of Western country, for example. So China is trying to avoid that. For example, decades of lifting 800 million people out of poverty. 10 years ahead of SDG 2030 agenda of UN, number 1 priority that cutting 70% of global poverty just by China alone. So what do you think about this culture and those historical factors and cultural factors?
Well, I believe in these cultural factors. I grew up in Scotland. In Scotland, you would hear many of the same things you just said about China. We give enormous respect for education. Very, very strong family ties. Actually, yesterday, or maybe the day before, I was talking to a group in the British Parliament, and one of the lords there, who was Scotsman, had said, that what worried him most about Scotland today was these family values that were so strong in his day seem to be weakening there. But, just come back to my half-joking comment about Marxism. Culture changes with the conditions of production. Mm-hmm. And, those Scottish families were thriving within a system where there were jobs. And, we have a friend, actually a brother-in-law, who said that when he decided to go to college in the 70s, 1972, his friends in New York, a relatively poor area of New York, his parents were Italian immigrants, and said, "Why are you going to college? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. You're going to use your diploma to pay the bills and so on." Now in Scotland, that wasn't the case. People really wanted to go to college. But these things change. And in these times in America where there were good jobs, where there were factories and so on. So every country is facing this change. And, the change is always going to be difficult to handle. And it seems to be particularly badly handled in the United States. I think China has done very well. I mean, you've embraced a form of markets, a form of capitalism, which has generated enormous amount of wealth and relieved a lot of poverty. But there are really dangers there too, because capitalism can get out of hand. And David had said, Chinese markets are very competitive. You got to keep them that way, because there are real dangers of people who get very rich undermining a competitive system. And a lot of that seems to happen in the US.